Welcome to the Wild Physio podcast with your host, Andrew Wild. Today I have Oliver Crossley on, who is a physiotherapist, yoga educator, and long-term Ashtanga, yoga, and Zen Buddhist practitioner. Is that how you say it?
Yeah, well done.
Sweet. He started yogic physio to bring the ancient yogic, is that how you say it?
Yep.
Practices into the modern worlds of healthcare and musculoskeletal rehabilitation and the scientific insights of pain, neuro and contemplative science into yoga and wellness cultures. Doing this has led him to teach across a range of yoga teaching training courses around Australia and online to students worldwide. Oliver is passionate about person-centered, evidence-based rehabilitation and loves helping people get back to moving at their best. His particular interest is in the treatment and management of persistent and complex pain conditions, which we'll cover today, and is currently completing his master's through Sydney University in pain management to be a titled APA pain physiotherapist, which I have not had on the podcast yet. So welcome to Oliver.
Thanks so much. Yeah, you said it better than I've ever explained it off my website. Thanks.
Probably should have pre-read that. There's a few little words there that I haven't read before out aloud.
No, you did well. It can sound a bit odd to sort of people who aren't familiar with anything yoga based or I guess in that sort of woo-woo culture to some people.
Yeah, and I'll be the first to admit I have never done yoga. The only times I can remember doing yoga were a couple of times in football training camps and that sort of thing, but I've never done yoga since then. And, I retired from football when I was 19. So it's probably been 15 years since I've done any type of yoga, and I've never been to a yoga class. So I'm a complete yoga nuffy. And I think this would be great because you'll be able to educate me on what yoga is. And this segues into my first question. How do you integrate yoga into physio practice? And what is yoga in physio practice and what isn't it? Because I think people have a warped sense of what yoga is when it comes to the physiotherapy side of things.
For sure, yeah. I might start with what it isn't and sort of broadly is, and then how it relates into physio. So one of the common misconceptions around yoga practice is that it's just stretching and poses in a sequence, and that it can sometimes have some confusing spiritual stuff attached to it. Broadly speaking, the word yoga has so many different conflicting definitions if you get into it nitty gritty, nerdy wise. But I guess what I'd say is it's a system of practices and a tradition of contemplative practice that tries to still the mind and see what's really going on inside it or in the person's life at that time to get a bit of clarity in whatever that means for them. But also to achieve a bit more well-being than might traditionally thought possible. And that's where sort of it goes beyond poses into, at least in terms of the doing part of yoga and outside of the philosophy of it, into breathing practices and focused attention or meditation practices. And so where it comes into physio practice is that so many of us have the symptoms that bring us to a physio practice, like pain, niggles, injury, as we now are seeing, in research in the last, I guess, maybe 10, 20 years, is that stress and nervous system dysregulation is a big part of that. So it's very useful to bring in, mindful breathing, or if the person's open to it, mindfulness meditation practices, and maybe a sequence of stretches or poses if they're into that as well, to help bring that down. And I've seen, even just in whiplash research out of Brisbane Uni, that this stuff's been really helpful for bringing down people's distress when pain is associated with a traumatic or distressing experience. I mean, it itself is a distressing experience.
And when you're using yoga and physio practice, are you using a lot of the mindfulness and breathing to achieve this? And segue that into this question, what is mindfulness and what are you trying to achieve with the breathing? I think you've already touched on it, but what are we trying to achieve?
Mm. It's mindfulness is sorry, my COVID brain's gone a bit empty. That mindfulness is the idea of the traditional definition comes from, at least in a Western context, from a guy called John Kabat-Zinn, who's a doctor from Massachusetts who integrated it in the 70s and is well known for the mindfulness-based stress reduction programs. His definition really fits across a wide range of what we'd now understand it to be. It's this idea of an ability to pay attention to something in the present moment without any elaboration, commentary, or reaction. So when it comes to the pain experience or in the physio room, a lot of these yoga practices are based off that attitude. It's in that way you could make your gym routine mindful in a certain way. Of course, it's something as foreign as, we're also used to having an internal dialogue, reacting to things that are pleasant, not wanting more of what's pleasant, not wanting what is unpleasant. It's a natural human biological reaction. But the sort of the paradox and the jewel in practicing mindfulness of any kind is that actually being with things as they are in a non-reactive way can really reduce the amount of distress emotionally, physically. We've had a wide range of research that's gone into this, and even neurophysiological evidence of reduced activity in different parts of the brain associated with the pain experience, and in both short, experienced and long-term experienced meditators.
And with the breathing techniques that you do use with patients or even when you're teaching, how do you go about that? How would you teach a yoga nuffi like myself to go about these practices to try and calm myself down and to use the regulation side of things with the nervous system? Because I agree with 100% what you're saying, especially with modern world. We're very overstimulated, aren't we? Computers, TV, iPads, we're just always stimulated and people struggle to sleep. So how would you go about the breathing side of things to teach someone that is completely new to it, like myself?
For sure. This is where first I'd ask if they're interested, because I'd explain, this can experience this sort of stress or sympathetic wind up can contribute to some of your experience, and there's a way we can change it. Would you be interested in trying a practice? Yes, maybe. And if they do, then I'd look into one of the most well-researched interventions that there are, and it's the basis of what I'd teach in an introductory yoga class, and it's just what we call slow-paced breathing. So normally you or I sitting here chatting, it'd be breathing as much as our physio textbooks remind us, 12 to 16 breaths a minute. Slow paced breathing involves slowing down our breath to about a rate of, on average, about 6 breaths a minute. So that's about 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out. Now, most people, when you get into the nerdy worlds of apnea training, like I have around me in the Gold Coast with the surfers and freedivers, people can take it to the extreme, but a lot of us have a poor CO2 tolerance. Carbon dioxide, for those who aren't aware, drives our, desire to breathe, our hunger for air. And so what happens is we don't want to slow down the breath too much because it can be itself a stressful experience, but we want to slow it down enough to start to change this sympathetic tone, this autonomic balance, dysregulation, whatever word you want to put to it. And so I just get them sitting there in a comfortable semi-reclined position on the physio bed, probably get them to close their eyes. And usually I've got a clock in my clinic room that ticks loud enough for it to be a bit of a metronome. So I'll go, okay, you can hear the clock in the background. We're just going to slow down our breath now. And I'd get them to aim for about 3 to 5 seconds in, 3 to 5 seconds out. And we do that together, much like you'd guide someone through a bicep curl or a deadlift for about 5 to 10 minutes so that they're comfortable with the experience. And then I'd see how they felt afterwards and explore whether they're interested in practicing it further at home.
And how often would they need to practice this at home to see changes and benefit?
Great question. We don't know too much because the research is still expanding in this area, but from what I've seen and from what I know personally, higher frequency is better for this stuff in lower doses, similar to mindfulness for beginners, because it not only builds that habit and that behavior change, adding in any new behavior is tricky, but it allows for that repeated touchstone of, this is what calm feels like. This is what it feels like to have a bit more control over how I feel and how stressed I am.
And do you use any resources or apps for patients, such as, I don't know, the Calm app or the Headspace app or something like that to help with this type of meditation, mindfulness, breathing practices?
For sure. There's a wide range of apps that I recommend. You mentioned a couple of great ones there. Calm and Headspace are really well known. One that I commonly advise to use because it's cheap and easy is the breathing app by a yoga teacher, an Ashtanga yoga teacher who same style of yoga that I practice. He's from New York and he created the breathing app, it's pretty much called. And you can just watch this circle expand and contract like you can in the Calm app. For people who need a bit more closer guidance, there's an app I've worked with to record a few lessons on called Wombat that I probably recommend the most because the guy who created it, Henry, is a doctor and he's aiming to make it very, clinical and science-based. And so Wombat's just done an update actually for those who end up listening to this. And I really recommend getting onto that because it has every breathing practice that I know of in short doses, 5 to 10 minute lessons that you can repeatedly, be guided through by really well-trained teachers.
Sounds like an Australian born and bred
Yep.
app. Yep. If they're going to call it Wombat.
Yeah, great name.
Yeah, indeed. So when it comes to pain, so obviously you're at the moment, which is great. And I've never interviewed anyone on my podcast that's doing a master's and they'll finish with an entitled APA pain physiotherapist title. So it's great to have you on. Now, for the listeners, what is pain? How would you describe it? This is going to be a tricky one to answer because you could probably talk about this for 15 minutes, no doubt. But go for it. See how you go.
Tricky. I've just come off a discussion module in the past few weeks in the degree where we discussed this because the International Association for the Study of Pain recently in 2020 changed the definition of it. Ultimately, I think if we take a pragmatic, simple approach, pain's just an experience and we all know when we have it, we know when we don't. It's very personal, it's very individual, and I think that's probably the most important thing. It's always real too. Sometimes as we find, and the reason for the change in the definition of pain, which I can read out if people are interested, is that often I think the big thing and the reason for even a subspecialty of physio that works with complex pain is because there's this really confusing distinction that seems counterintuitive that pain and tissue damage are separate phenomenon, which is increasingly being understood by many clinicians and some, lay people, but it requires us to go, well, what's going on then? And obviously it's a complex process. So there's arguments that it's just a sensation and that it's always coming from some kind of tissue damage. And yeah, the brain and the central nervous system and all of its complex functioning are involved, but you sit on a thorn, you feel an ouch. And then there's, the neuroscientists that get into the complexity of it, the behavioral scientists that go, oh, it's a perception. And it's always got this complex, very individualized, I'm running out of words, perceptual process that's based on your history, your experiences, and your unique biology. Trying to be as scientific as I can. I'm ambivalent. I sit on the fence, always willing to be proved wrong, but I definitely see it as an experience that's heavily perceptually weighted. It can be changed by a lot of things that you wouldn't expect, and it's not always associated with tissue damage. And then I might stop the rant there.
You beat me to it, actually. I was going to ask you, just for the listeners, can you have pain without tissue damage and vice versa?
Yeah, well, I asked that question to a man very worth mentioning on this podcast, a fellow resident of Sydney, Timothy Austin, who's the first Australian pain titled physio who helps run the Sydney pain management program. And when I asked that question on a discussion board, he responded and said, well, we're still not sure. There's people shouting from either end of either camp, saying that, pain always requires tissue damage to occur, even if it's minor. Even us most of us listening to this podcast right now would most likely be stationary or maybe exercising. And we can all feel maybe a level of discomfort somewhere in our body, and that we neurophysiologically or physiologically label nociception, which just means, if you want to translate it as danger or detection, some kind of thermal, mechanical, or chemical stimulus. Sorry, brain's catching up. So, and then the other side is, well, no, tissue damage is neither necessary nor sufficient for the experience of pain. And Tim shared this study that really confused me and has left me going, huh, where they got 100 people and they showed them pictures, 7 pictures, I think 10 pictures, sorry, and 3 videos of people experiencing quite significant pain. And 31, I think, around the low 30s, a significant chunk of the sample reported feeling pain in the same area of their body as the people that they witnessed on the pictures and videos, despite having no tissue damage going on in their body at that time. And they screened for a lot of, personality and psychosocial factors. Yes, empathy was involved, and there's an argument around things like that. But we've also found that if you zap certain parts of the brain, like the, I'm just trying to remember now, parts of the thalamus and the basal ganglia, you can experience pain just by zapping a part of the nervous system. So I'm currently camp, maybe it doesn't require tissue damage, but probably most of the time it does for anyone, for the vast majority of people presenting to a physio clinic or just living their life.
It's well known that you can have a lot of age-related changes in a joint or joints and have no pain, though, because that's been shown many times in many great studies, including the Brzezinski study, I think it was 2015, I think it was.
Yeah.
So that gets quoted a lot online, you see. So that is a different conversation, though.
It is. And I often have a mentor of mine, Robin Kerr, very quickly reminds me that there's a follow-up to that 2015 study that found that whilst there is asymptomatic changes in many people as we age, I'm nearly 30 and 1 in 3 people my age have a disc bulge. And I say that to clients all the time, and helps de-threaten the pain experience and any crazy things that might come up on an MRI. But there are certain things that come up on MRIs that are more likely to give you pain. It's not the whole reason. It's kind of like labral tears. Like you're more likely to have hip pain if you have a labral tear, but a lot of people have pain. A lot of people have labral tears without hip pain. Joe and Kemple is a great one to listen to on that. So I think it's just really complicated.
Yeah. And because it is complicated, are there any analogies that you like to use with your patients when you are describing pain?
Yeah, for sure. There are many out there. Lately, I've been basing mine off a broader view of kind of similar to Greg Lehman's cup analogy that I think's been referenced on this podcast before, or commented on a lot out
It
there.
has, yep.
Yep, Adam Meakin's circles, all these different things. But this idea that actually lately I've been using kind of money in a bank in terms of resources to handle stress. And because we're a biological organism, we want to get past this idea of the mind and body being very separate. And so often we can, if I bring up a stress conversation, it very quickly is like, oh, well, I'm not stressed, bro. You're a physio to massage my back. And I go, yeah, no, okay, I understand your reservations, but the stress is a biological event. And so sometimes the body doesn't recognize, or it has similar processes going on from the stress of a uni exam as it is from the stress of running too much or too little, or a physical injury. And so I often say that the body's got so much money in the bank, and if we spend it all because we're sleep deprived, trying to keep 3 kids going to school and doing a full-time job, then maybe we're not recovering as well from the activity that we're trying to fit in around that. A lot of busy mums I'll see, they'll go out for a run at 8 p.m. after they've finished work and kids and everything, and I go, that's awesome, I'm inspired by your dedication, but are you recovering from that? And then maybe that's where some tissue damage can build up, and sensitivities, and all kinds of biological processes that, unless they're really nerdy about it, I won't go into.
I haven't heard that analogy before. That's a good one. I like it.
Yeah, it's I've actually I never come up with anything new. I've taken it from a recent paper. I've just forgotten the guy's name, an Irish physio that Just bringing up. It's a recent paper on allostatic load from some physios that talk about what's going on. Martin Raby and I never pronounce this name right. It's an Irish name, Niall Maloney.
Yeah.
It's a really cool paper that looks into how stress and the biological processes underlying it can contribute to positively and negatively the emergence of pain. And so
Right.
this idea that we've got, only so much to deal with. And of course, we can build our reserves as we all know, but at least in the short term, we've got to be mindful.
Yeah. So you're building your bank up, much like you're building your cup up in a way with
Yeah.
that analogy. Yeah.
Yeah.
And when it comes to persistent pain,
Mm.
so what is persistent pain for one? And do you typically use the terminology persistent rather than chronic?
Yeah, that's a good question. Persistent pain or chronic pain, there's been the reason for the word persistent, as I've heard Lorimer Moseley say, excuse me, is because the word chronic has so many negative connotations to it, and the idea that it might be inescapable, that once
Yes.
you've got it. And so the word persistent pain's become used a lot recently by clinicians in this area in the last decade to try and go, hey, yeah, it's been around for a long time. Maybe it doesn't have to be there forever. So what I mean, what it is anything going over 3 months, but of course, even just this week, reading papers on it and the changing diagnostic categories around chronic pain and the latest international classification of diseases, it's this arbitrary line of anything over 3 months, and obviously beyond that. So it can, of course, you don't get to the 11-week mark and go, oh, I'm nearly got chronic pain. It's
Yeah.
but because with research and with studies, you got to draw a line in the sand and go, this point here is where we start measuring. I guess it's a reasonable point.
Yeah. And if someone did have persistent pain, how would one overcome that? That is a really tricky question because everyone's individual and every injury is individual and the persistent pain is theirs. It's an experience. What are some strategies one can use?
Big question, and one that I am humbly confident yet not assured of the answer, because there's a hell of a lot of uncertainty in the process and in the pain experience for everyone. So my gist of it, and reading a lot of recent research, particularly around integrating psychologically informed and what we now might call trans-diagnostic approaches to persistent pain management, is that change is possible, recovery is possible, but first there needs to be a very honest and flexible look at what that is, what that means, because of course it will mean something different for everyone. This is where a lot of ideas out of acceptance and commitment therapy are rushing in and seeing some reasonably good evidence to support it, that we need to be a little bit more psychologically flexible as to what recovery looks like and how we get there, because part of the process of not recovering or feeling stuck is that we confuse, as they say in ACT, to who we used to be. And even as a person who, right now isn't crippled with persistent pain, we all have to grow and change and understand that new parts of ourselves and evolving parts of ourselves. And so I say it's the same and even more important for those in persistent pain. So it starts with kind of going, well, who do I want to become, rather than who can I go back to being, because that's a really tricky path. It's and one that is arguably not possible. But you can become someone new, and certainly someone more hopeful and active. And then within that, with a skilled clinician or team, you set some goals, and from those goals, I think then the two key parts for me, based off a lot of the great work from Lorimer Moseley and his team over the last 10 years, and particularly drawing inspiration from a telehealth chronic pain program that's grown out of that same research in Adelaide called the Brain Changer or Boost Recovery Program that I've learned a lot from. They see it as sort of two parts. You learn to self-regulate, which is where I get excited because all the yoga stuff comes in. You learn to, once you've got a goal, you learn how to adjust your responses to stress levels, calm yourself down, self-regulate better, and learn some self-awareness skills. So you might be practicing mindfulness, you might be learning stress management skills. A lot of things, this is where a good psychologist can come in, or if the rare kind of very well psychologically trained physio, hence the niche direction I'm going. And once you've got these self-management skills, you're better able to, navigate your life and not go into these boom bust cycles, and learn some activity pacing. And I mean, we could talk for hours on it. There's textbooks being written, but then the last bit is graded exposure, or progressing, strengthening ourselves back to the sorts of activities that we want to do. And that will usually involve some kind of exercise. We might not use that word. We might use graded movement. It's always got to be person-centered. That's probably the key bit that I haven't said yet. Because then, as we know, it's all based off this idea that we're not static. The body, the mind, the nervous system is plastic. So we want to work with that rather than against it. And that's where we can expose ourselves to walking an extra 10 meters, maybe lifting some weights, maybe doing some yoga. It's all about what's meaningful to the person, because with that meaning comes a lot of the what I would call inappropriately named placebo effects that can come with that, because it sort of downplays it. But the body's so good at creating its own pain relief when it thinks it should. And so if we go, oh my gosh, I'm finally walking with my dog and my daughters and my husband again, then there might be a lot of emotive and extra factors assisting that process. But yeah, I think it's about flexibility of goals and seeing and framing of yourself, learning self-regulation and a good psychological skill toolkit, and finally graded exposure stuff. And that's where physio is best, because we come in and we know how to work with people and be with them along the journey.
If someone has persistent pain, are there any resources that you would recommend they check out?
Oh, there is an infinite amount. The first things that always come to mind for those that want to know why things are happening are any of the explain pain books.
Yeah.
My favorite thing, excuse me, I'll need to cough. My favorite book, and it sort of frames the treatment paradigm that I use, is the Protectometer Manual from the NOI group, which is an active book that you can use and work with to understand what things trigger and worsen your pain, and what things make you feel better, and how to tip the scales in your favor. There's online resources galore. Some people like the Curable app, but there's criticisms that it might be a bit too brain-centric, but it's there. It can be useful. There's books galore. Tame the Beast online.
Yeah, love
Alison
that.
Sim has written a great series of things online. She's a wonderful pain specialized osteopath. That's the word. Thanks. And what's the last one? There's another one. Pain Toolkit by Pete, someone from Canada. I've forgotten his last name. I'd have to make a list. Yeah, there's actually so much out there. It's really quite reassuring. But and of course, Greg Lehman's recovery book is pretty good too.
Yeah,
awesome actually.
Might even be a good idea if you could put all of these up on maybe an Instagram, do a post or do a story or something like that, and then I'll share it if you tag me in it, and then we can get that around.
That's a great idea. I'll do that.
That is a good idea. You're being a trooper as well, because Oliver has COVID. He's currently in isolation. Yeah, you're doing well, mate.
No, thank you.
Only a couple more questions. So how do you train? So with all this knowledge that you have, how do you go about it each week?
In terms of like exercise, what I do with my
Yeah.
body. Yeah. I struggle with this because I wish I had more time. I love doing everything. I'm really passionate about the style of yoga that I practice for the last 11 years because it's been a really close friend, if you will. It's called Ashtanga yoga. It's a pretty dynamic physical form of yoga. If people want to be weirded out, they can check some of the videos on my Instagram. It's certainly like challenging, and so it's got that aspect of strength to it that's kept me there as, I guess, a young man. And then it's also got the self-regulation, the breathing, the flexibility. Outside of that, I've recently really gotten onto road cycling.
Oh yeah.
And it's been really awesome. It's actually helped nearly fully resolve a long-standing hamstring tendinopathy I've had from overdoing it in yoga. And having that increased, I guess, aerobic fitness has been great. I think it just rubbed off on me because I work at a clinic in the Gold Coast Pogo where I'm surrounded by runners and triathletes. Brad here is the famous running physio. So yeah, they just rub off on me. But otherwise, Gold Coast, everyone surfs. I love that when I can fit it in, and I get in the gym a little bit as well just to fill in the gaps because you need that strength that other things can't get.
Yeah, for sure. It sounds like you're doing plenty of exercise, which most physios should be doing.
Yeah,
Should practice what we preach.
exactly what we talk.
Exactly. And speaking of your Instagram's great. You got a lot of followers now, and I agree. There's a couple of videos and photos and stuff of you performing your yoga poses, and it's pretty impressive stuff. As you said, it's very physical, and it's a lot of body weight holds, and it seems very sort of calisthenics type yoga-y. I suppose you'd put it in a similar sort of bucket in a way, because
completely.
some of the positions you get into, mate, I wouldn't be able to do it. I don't have the flexibility. I've probably got the strength, but not the flexibility.
Yeah. It's actually, I think part of the reason that I talk about this a lot, that I love it so much, is that similar to you, I was no great footballer, but growing up in Darwin, mostly towards the end of high school, I'm AFL obsessed. Still a Saints fan, and we're coming back, but I was not very flexible. And so when I started, people look at me now and they go, "Oh, you must be hypermobile." And I'm like, no, I'm not. Definitely not. I've become that way, but it's been a great example in the adaptability and plasticity of the human body. This is, I mean, not that it's necessary to put your leg behind your head, but it's possible. And so if that's possible, then maybe persistent pain recovery is too.
Great way to finish. And where can people find you if they either want to check out your Instagram or whether they want to book in a consult with you? How do they go about that?
Sure. Thanks, man. I'm very active on Instagram, so at yogic, YOGIC physio, yogic physio. I've got a website that has some old blogs and a little bit about what I'm about, but it needs an update. Yogicphysio.com, and that will direct you to where I work and where I consult from, which is Pogo Physio on the Gold Coast. Work with a great team there, and under Brad Beer, and that's where I am.
Great. Thank you so much for your time. It's been a fascinating chat, and we'll have to do it again soon.
For sure. Thank you very much, man.
No worries. As usual, stay strong.